Lying to children. That's the topic of today's Bold and Blunt. Lying to children in the public school systems, teaching them to hate America, teaching children to detest the country in which they live, teaching children, our next generation of American leaders, politicians, government representatives, business leaders, teaching these next generation of leaders that America needs to go on a mass apology tour for all that America represents. American exceptionalism? That's so yesterday. In today's leftist-leaning dominated political system and education system, it's all about teaching the youth to hate America. Welcome to Bold and Blunt, and I'm your host, Cheryl Chumley, giving you a Christian conservative look at today's news, politics, culture, and events. And I just want to remind you that you can get Bold and Blunt delivered right to your email box twice a week. If you go to WashingtonTimes.com, find my hyperlinked name, Cheryl Chumley, click on it, scroll to the bottom, sign up for my 3 times a week newsletters at the Washington Times to get all my commentaries that I write, as well as my twice weekly podcasts that come out on Tuesdays and Thursdays. You'll get them right to your email box, so you don't have to go to the Washington Times and search for them any longer. Isn't that convenient? But guess what? There's also another way you can get my podcasts, and that is by going to Edify. Edify Online, EDIFI. It is a Christian podcasting platform. And not only can you pick up Bold and Blunt there, subscribe to it there, access it there, but you can check out all the other great faith-based podcasts that are put out by Edify on Edify for your edification. So check it out, edify.com. Now for today's podcast, what is going on in America's school systems? You know, I went through the public school systems. I went through the public school systems in Massachusetts. I was a child of the 80s, and when I was growing up, of course, there were issues in the public school systems, but never once do I remember in my K through 12 education having teachers who harped on how terrible America was. Quite the opposite. In fact, I had weeks and weeks of specialized instruction in the Constitution. It was in civics class. It was in social studies class. There was a special segment where it was 2 or 3 weeks, maybe it was even longer than that, where we specifically studied the Constitution and applying the Constitution to modern life and why the Constitution mattered and what made the Constitution so great and why founding fathers set up a country that was so different and above all other countries. I don't remember my teachers, and this was even in liberal La Loon land of Massachusetts, right? That's where I was born and raised. This was even in the Democrat stronghold of Massachusetts. My public school teachers, as far as I can remember, did not bash America. No, they spoke about the Constitution in glowing terms. They taught us to respect the Constitution. We actually read the Declaration of Independence. I remember distinctly a history teacher I had in public school, and he spent much time on explaining why the Constitution and Declaration was so great and why things like the League of Nations, which was the precursor to the United Nations, why things like the League of Nations was so opposed in America, and why opposing the League of Nations, which was the precursor to the United Nations, why that was a right decision for America to make, why Americans rightly rose up against the League of Nations. And why did they? Because Americans didn't need other countries telling American citizens how to act, how to behave, how to govern, how to self-govern. Americans were and are supposed to be fiercely independent when it comes to such matters. But nowadays in public school systems, it's much more about how to indoctrinate the rising generation into the belief that America is bad, America is more than bad, America is evil. America needs to bow down and bow heads collectively and apologize for being America, and Americans by and large need to adopt practices and governments from other countries, not even Europe any longer. We need to adopt China policies. If you listen to Bill Gates, if you listen to Anthony Fauci, if you listen to the communists at the United Nations, America is all that's wrong with the world. And China and communism in China and Chinese policies and collectivism and dictatorships and trouncing of individual liberties and trouncing of churches, that's the New World Order. That's the way of the New World. That's the way that the world ought to go. And America, as dastardly as we Americans are standing in the way of this communist, Marxist progress. This is what's being taught to our youth. And under the last year and a half of coronavirus clampdowns, where kids were kept home from school and they were told to get their studies online from pre-recorded videos that their teachers would make and slap online before they headed off to their beach vacations and so forth, and paid their union dues so their union leaders could ensure that their continued stay-at-home status was uninterrupted. Before the coronavirus clampdowns came and had students studying online, parents, by and large, were unaware of the anti-American sentiments that were being taught, not just in history, but in science, in communications, in English, in about any course their kids were taking in school. But then the coronavirus came, and suddenly parents saw their online courses, and suddenly parents saw just how far the left-leaning communists in the teachers' unions had dug their claws into public school systems over the last years. It's like a sleeping giant was awakened, right? Parents now standing before school boards and railing against these anti-American, blatantly communist type of teachings and programs and course materials that are being shoved onto their students, into their students' minds, from LGBTQ in kindergarten, agendas like that being taught, to hate America, capitalism is racist types of theories being taught to high schoolers. And that just lays the groundwork easily for the communists who have already taken over the higher places of learning, the colleges and universities in most of America, to just put the icing on the cake and make sure that students' ability to critically think, to ask critical questions, to question authority is completely stamped out. So you get kids graduating high school with an anti-American outlook, going on to college to really boot stamp that outlook even deeper and to teach them to become activists in society rather than productive members of society, to become professional protesters in the vein of Black Lives Matter and Antifa, where the means, as violent as they may be, always justify the ends, if the ends is indeed socialism / communism / collectivism. And this is now called America's public school system. No wonder, real clear opinion research, a poll just found 71% of voters back school choice. This is the highest level of support. I'm reading right from the poll now. This is the highest level of support ever recorded from major AFC national polling with a sample size above 800 voters. 65% support parents having access to a portion of per pupil funding to use for home, virtual, or private education if public schools didn't reopen full-time for in-person classes. This poll was conducted in April 2021, and it was conducted at a time where it was still being debated and bartered and bandied about whether schools in America, public schools, would open in the fall, in September 2021 or August 2021, as the case may be in your particular state and community, but whether schools would open because of the coronavirus. And more to truth, not so much because of the coronavirus, but because the way the unions, the teachers' unions, and the politicians had successfully politicized the coronavirus to use it as a dangle to get more funding. If you give me more funding, we'll open the school for in-school instruction. If you don't give me more funding, well, it's safety and security first, the health of our students first. They have to stay home. So it's almost been a blessing in disguise, right? The year and a half of coronavirus shutdowns that had kids learning, and in some cases, in most cases, not learning at home, because in the end, parents were forced to acknowledge the communist takeover and infiltration of the public school systems. And now, we can't deny it any longer. The nation cannot deny that America's school systems have become propaganda breeding grounds, propaganda training grounds for the far left. There's no going back. There's no closing our eyes and putting the blinders back on and ignoring that truth. If you're a parent and you have children in America's public school systems, you cannot deny what's taking place in the school systems is not learning, is not reading, writing, arithmetic learning, but it's pure propaganda for the far left. And if you as a parent, even now, do not put a stop to that, either by going to your school board meetings and demanding that they stop the communist nonsense, or by countering what your teachers are teaching in school with proper teaching at home, at the dinner table, around the dinner table, with your kids, separately, individually, then you're part of the problem. You're part of the anti-American problem that's seeping into the next generation of America's leaders. Whether you have kids or not, the thing is, it's the kids who grow up and become the political leaders in America. It's the kids who grow up and become the business leaders in America. So unless you live in the woods by yourself, far, far away, off the grid, and have no contact with anyone else, in which case I want to thank you for listening to Bold and Blunt, because that is a remarkable feat, and I'm humbled that living off the grid you would listen to this. But unless you do, then you need to get in the fight, because it's going to affect you. What tomorrow's leaders learn in today's school systems is going to affect you one way or the other, whether in the political world or the business world or the economic world or just the cultural world. If you have a bunch of communists leading in America, in the business, in the political, in the education sectors, it's going to affect you. It's going to affect your individualism. It's going to affect your freedom. It's going to affect the fate of an entire nation. So it's with great honor that I introduce today's guest, today's Bold and Blunt podcast guest, Dr. Mary Grabar. She has written a newest bestseller, a newest, most important book, Debunking the 1619 Project. It just came out, and if you hadn't had opportunity yet to go order it, I really implore you, go to Amazon, order her book, Debunking the 1619 Project, exposing the plan to divide America. Because look, this is a whole strategy of the left. It's not just about teaching a different type of values or a different thought process or just presenting kids with an alternative point of view and then allowing them to discuss and debate. It's not about that. It's not about a critical thinking approach to American history. It's not about presenting different viewpoints. It's not even about diversity and equality, which, you know what, I'm all for. More education, not less. More viewpoints presented, not fewer. But you have to have, while all those viewpoints are being discussed and presented, you have to have opportunity for children, for youth, for maturing adults to debate the pros and cons and merits and disadvantages and benefits and problems with all the various theories. And the 1619 Project isn't that. It ain't doing that. It's just telling your kids, you better hate America, otherwise you're the problem in America. If you don't hate America, you're racist. That's what's going on in America's school systems right now. And Mary Grabar has written this great book, it's #1 new release in U.S. colonial period history on Amazon. That's just this snapshot in time. Wait a day and it'll be #1 new release in a different category. But if you haven't had a chance to get it, order it. But in the meanwhile, Mary Grabar, thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
So let's talk about your new book about critical race theory, the 1619 Project, and what was the rationale for your writing this? What was the line of logic that led you to write this?
Well, I saw it when it came out in 2019 and saw that it was a piece of propaganda, obviously, presented our country's history in such stark black and white terms, and that's literally as a nation of oppressors and oppressed that attempted to replace 1776 with 1619. And so I started digging into it and seeing what was being left out, what was being distorted. I had done that with Howard Zinn in my previous book a couple years ago. And so I just started digging and uncovering all these things that were just absolutely wrong, and they're being taught in schools.
And there are some people out there now that still argue that critical race theory is not being taught in public school systems. And how do you respond to that?
That is a lie. It is absolutely being taught. As a matter of fact, I will read a guiding question for the lead essay of the 1619 Project for students. How have laws, policies, and systems developed to enforce the enslavement of Black Americans before the Civil War influenced laws, policies, and systems in years since? So critical race theory basically says that because of history, our values, our guiding principles in government and the law are inadequate. So you have to go back to history, see how certain groups have been mistreated, and then compensate for it. And that guiding question right there speaks to critical race theory.
Does that serve what you just explained? Does that serve as a valid definition of critical race theory? Because that is another discrepancy that's being thrown out there, that critical race theory means this to one person, it means something else to someone else. How would you define it?
Well, critical race theory is something I was reading when I was in graduate school in the English department back in the 1990s. And it basically is a neo-Marxist theory that looks at people as groups rather than as individuals. And it looks at the present through this lens of a distorted past. So in order to enforce real justice, the critical race theorist says you have to take account of what happened in the past and discriminate in the present, because any individual is a reflection of his or her group. So if you are Black or Hispanic or whatever, you are oppressed. It doesn't matter, what your economic status is. And so it uses the past, a distorted view of the past, to promote social justice in the present. And the legal foundation is antithetical to what is ideal in our system, which is that justice is blind and justice is equal, and that we live by the rule of law and our Constitution, and so forth. So it's an attempt to undermine the American system.
So what is the end game of advocates of critical race theory? Is it that they just don't think and see where this leads to, divisiveness and destruction? Or is it they really believe this is going to bring about some greater good for society?
Well, they absolutely believe it, and they are Marxists, they are neo-Marxists. They may not have read Das Kapital, but they are admirers of Fidel Castro. The creator of the 1619 Project has expressed her admiration for Castro and for Cuba, and she thinks it provides a model for America. At the least, they are in line with the squad of the Democratic Party, the far left wing, and they want to see socialism implemented. And they present socialism as the solution to overcoming this racism that is in our country, that's in our very DNA, as the 1619 Project puts it.
I have a very difficult time understanding why people think that socialism works when history is filled with examples of its failures. What is going through these people's minds that they think teaching American children to hate their country as is and being needful of a complete overhaul is something that is going to bring about a greater good that they envision in their minds?
Yeah, well, I think there are a couple things that are motivating them. One is money. They're making an incredible amount of money, and as I document in Debunking the 1619 Project, the creator of this whole initiative, her speaking fees rose from $10,000 a pop to $25,000 a pop, and she was doing them about twice a month. So there's that. They are also, as far as I can tell about her, are very ignorant of real history. They've been swayed by teachers. In her case, she was inspired by a high school black studies teacher to read Lerone Bennett, and that's basically the foundation of her understanding of history. Lerone Bennett was not a historian. He was a writer for Ebony magazine in the 1960s, and he coined the term Black Power. And so she looks at the world through the lens of Black Power, and so is not really, I don't know if she is not aware of, what has really happened under communism. Maybe she's like a lot of my students when I was teaching college. They would say, well, it just hasn't been done in the right way. The wrong people have been doing it, and we can make it work. Right. They were saying that during, the Occupy Wall Street protest back in 2011.
When you were doing your research for your book, Debunking the 1619 Project, what were some of the glaring deceptions that you found in this project's teachings?
Well, first of all, the idea that the slaves, the Africans that were on the White Lion, the privateering ship that, surprised the people at Jamestown, that they were kidnapped from Africa, and that is completely false. The Europeans were never able to go inland and kidnap them. The Portuguese tried it a few times, and they were slaughtered. So routinely what happened was that the fellow Africans would raid a village and capture the slaves. It was in warfare. They would sell them to the middlemen after they were marched for sometimes months to the barracoons, and then they were sold to the Europeans. So she presents this idea that, the African slaves, before they were slaves, were living in this kind of domestic harmony in Africa, which is completely false. So that's one thing. She doesn't mention the fact that that slavery changed, it evolved, that it wasn't really codified until the late 17th century. She pretends that, here these Africans were brought here, and from that moment on, they were slaves. As a matter of fact, the first legal ruling in favor of slavery was for one of those Africans, Anthony Johnson, whose slave insisted he was just an indentured servant and was suing for his freedom, but the court ruled in favor of the slave owner, Anthony Johnson, who was a black man. And there were a number of black slave owners who even wanted to fight on the side of the Confederacy and would have it if they had been allowed, because they owned slaves and they made their wealth that way. So, one of the premises of the 1619 Project that all white people were either enslavers or benefited from slavery, and all black people were slaves or oppressed or descendants of slaves, is wrong. And so this notion that, one race is entirely virtuous and the other race is evil is shattered when you look at the complicated history, as I do in, debunking the 1619 Project.
And what you just said, that one little tidbit of factual history that you gave about the Portuguese and Africans selling their fellow Africans to Europeans to sell as slaves here in America. Just because of that one fact, I want to read your book. And I'm sure it's filled with historical truths that go largely unreported and untaught in the public school system and in the media.
Yes, absolutely. And as I point out in my book, too, I used to go sort of undercover to these teachers' conferences, and I went to the Organization of American Historians conference in 2014, I think it was, and there was a workshop on teaching high school students about slavery. And this professor was teaching these other teachers how to do a role play with pretend that there's a pregnant slave and she's going to be whipped and she's going to be put into this contraption where the fetus is not harmed. No doubt that awful things like that happened. But when one of the teachers spoke up to ask a question about, shouldn't we say that only 5% of the Africans that were transported in the transatlantic slave trade actually came here to the colonies or, to this country, she was told to downplay it. So these facts, if teachers do know about them, are, they are instructed to not mention them, and you won't find them in the materials. I've looked at a couple of textbooks, major textbooks, and the way slavery is presented, it is the way, the 1619 Project presents it, which is as an exclusively white practice against blacks. But if you look at it in worldwide context, you see that it has been practiced, since time immemorial. And in 1776, the only places that did not have slavery were Western Europe. It was not legal there, although it was in the colonies, and Antarctica.
Wow. That's,
no slaves in Antarctica.
I think a lot of us formed our views of slavery in terms of getting images in our mind of it anyhow by watching that series Roots based off Alex Haley's book. And I'm just curious, historically speaking, how factual was that whole series? I imagine you must have seen it yourself.
Oh gosh, I remember it.
Yeah.
And it took people by storm, but it's all fictional.
Of course.
It's fiction. It's been debunked, but I'm sure students are being shown that movie and are being taught the same narrative about Europeans kidnapping. Coming in, kidnapping Africans. I was here at a they had a artist in residence over here at Hamilton College, and she was basically screaming some spoken word thing about the white men coming into Africa, which of course is absolutely fictional and ludicrous.
It's fascinating how history can get so skewed, and then it becomes part of the societal teachings from generation to generation practically. I know our time is tight, but I just wanted to finish with this one last question, if you don't mind. So how, in your view, should America's history with slavery be taught?
Well, when I was teaching, multiculturalism was the big buzzword. Everything had to be multicultural literature, multicultural everything. And I think slavery should be taught from a multicultural perspective, a global perspective. And in order to get a sort of a balanced view of what was going on in the United States, you need to look at slavery in its context. And once you do that, you can see how we were the leaders in eliminating this institution that had been accepted since as far back as we can go in history. So, it's not according to the year 2021, but in the context of the world at the time, we were advanced, the West was advanced, and certainly, the colonies and then our nation was advanced in eliminating this institution.
Teaching history in context. What a concept, right?
Absolutely, yeah. It's kind of funny how things are switched around, Multiculturalism, globalism is good for one thing, but not another, right?
Yeah, that's point well taken. Exactly. Well, Dr. Mary Grabar, I really appreciate your time, and I can't wait to read your book. It sounds phenomenal. It's going to be a bestseller, Debunking the 1619 Project. People can get it on Amazon.
Oh, absolutely. You can get it Books A Million. There's an indie, place where you can get it, Barnes & Noble, through Regnery. Regnery's the publisher. People can go to my website, dissidentprof.com. I've got a link. You can sign up for my newsletter, and I invite people to do that.
Perfect. Thank you for writing this, and thank you for your time on Bold and Blunt. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Lying to children. Lying to children. Lying to youth. It's one of the great evils. It's one of the greatest evils in the world. Jesus did teach that those who do wrong to the littlest will suffer great prices in heaven. And of course, the secular left doesn't believe in Jesus, so they don't take that consequence to heart. They should. If you want to make a difference in America, if you want to make a difference in preserving America's liberties for the youth of the future, for the generations of the future, fight to get the proper education for today's youth. Fight to get the proper education about American exceptionalism in America's public school systems. The fate of the entire nation depends upon truthful history being taught in the public school systems. Thank you for listening. If you like Bold and Blunt, please go to Washington Times and subscribe to my newsletter, where you will also get in your newsletter 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, my twice weekly Bold and Blunt podcast. Or go to Edify Online, subscribe to Bold and Blunt there, and check out the other faith-based podcasts at Edify, because we all need some faith in these dark times, don't we? Thank you for listening. Tune in next time, and in the meanwhile, don't forget, stay blunt, stay bold.